Several of us spent the past couple of days walking labyrinths to the clanging sounds of cowbells in the Jura Mountains at our congregational retreat. That might help explain something of what's going on the floor here. These winding paths spiraling toward a space at the center are ancient tools for prayer, and we prayed our way through them in a variety of ways, with song and silence, alone and with others. It was a good time together. And during the retreat, Jerry reminded us that a maze and a labyrinth are not the same thing. The two might actually look pretty similar at a first glance, but there's an important difference. You may find yourself getting lost in a maze, but there's no way to get lost in a labyrinth. Labyrinths have no dead ends, no possible wrong turns. If you put one foot in front of the other and keep going, you'll find your way to the center. So are parables mazes or labyrinths? I think I'm supposed to say that a parable is more like a labyrinth, that it's not a puzzle you solve, but something that you simply walk through. I think I'm supposed to say that, but the parable we have in front of us this morning, this tale of the rich man and Lazarus, truly felt more like a maze to me this week, mostly because as I tried to put myself into this strange and frightening story, I was aware of how many dead ends I could see. To start with, you have this whole heaven and hell setting. And if you ask me, I think getting too much into the details there runs into lots of dead ends in this parable. Interpreters have gotten pretty caught up with this kind of reading over the years. In Luther's time, people were debating where exactly the bosom of Abraham was located. Is that actually in heaven, or is that near heaven? Do we go there right when we die, or do we wait for the resurrection? Those kinds of questions. You can see how the parable would lead people to wondering about life after death. Most of the action takes place after the characters have died, and of course the story is written with this vivid depiction of the suffering that the rich man faces and the comfort that Lazarus finds. It's one of the New Testament's most vivid pictures of the afterlife. The problem with taking that too far, I think, is that Jesus is telling a story here. He isn't giving a discourse on exactly what happens after the grave. He's telling a story that's first and foremost about these two characters and about the obvious contrast between them. One fabulously wealthy and the other devastatingly poor. I don't think the heaven and hell imagery certainly serves a point, but I'm not sure it's meant to be taken too literally. I didn't run too far down that dead-end path this week, but I did run down another one for quite a while. One way to read a parable, any parable, is to try to find yourself in it, to find what character you seem to be nearest to. And I found myself stuck with these two main characters, and not really sure I identified too much with either of them. There's no question that I'm no Lazarus. For most of us here, that's certainly the case. The story makes it clear Lazarus is not only poor, but stuck in crippling poverty. He has no home but the gate outside the house of the rich man. He's hungry enough to eat scraps from his table, but none seem to be coming his way. He suffers from untreated sores and stray dogs in the street. There's no question that I'm no Lazarus, and I want to say the same thing about the rich man in the story, that I'm certainly not like him either. I tend to think of myself as living pretty modestly. I don't buy high-fashion clothes. I don't live in a mansion. Our family tends to eat a lot of vegetable soup for dinner. I don't feel like I have a whole lot in common with this rich man in today's parable, this guy who lives in a gated palace and dresses in the first-century equivalent of Gucci suits and eats like a king on a daily basis. He sounds like a whole different breed. I may not think of myself as rich, but that's a relative term, of course. In a Bible study last year in our congregation, I remember Bethel, a member of our church, saying that in her particular home context in Malawi, riches is a house with food on the table, a house where no child is crying. Those were her words. There's no question that by that measure, I'm a very wealthy person. We may not think of ourselves as rich, but for the most part, our community is made up of people much closer to the parable's rich man than to the poor one. It's really important to notice that. Still, I find that is something of a dead end when it comes to knowing what this parable means for us, largely because the rich man in the parable is, well, dead, and we're not. And that's a very important difference. If this parable is going to have something to say to us here and now, on this side of the grave, then there's got to be more to it than putting ourselves in one of those two main characters' shoes. It was only after bumping into a few dead ends in this maze of a parable that I started wondering if it isn't about something a bit simpler, something a bit more ordinary than all that talk about heaven and hell and which character we are. It's certainly a word about God's priorities, about God's concern with economic disparity and concern for those who are poor. And maybe for us, it's a word about seeing, about who we see and who we don't. There's a wonderful old story by the writer Flannery O'Connor that's about this too. Some of you may know it. The story opens in a doctor's waiting room where Mrs. Turpin has just arrived for an appointment. Mrs. Turpin is a proud, proper, respectable woman, and you quickly find she needs very little information before she decides what she thinks of everyone else in the room. With a quick glance, she can tell who is poor and who is not, who is educated and who is not, who is like her and who is clearly beneath her. The story is set in the rural American South sometime in the middle of the last century, and the categories, including the racial ones, are not difficult for her, a well-off white person, to sort out. She even takes comfort in her belief that God has ordered the whole thing just so. "Thank you, Jesus," she says to herself, "for making everything the way it is." She finds her neatly ordered world shaken up when a young woman in the waiting room throws a book at her for no apparent reason and calls her a terrible name. I'll leave it to you to read the story sometime to find out what. But for the rest of the day, she can't shake this experience of being insulted. She, who has always been so firmly at the top of the hierarchy. It's the end of the story that gives me goosebumps. Mrs. Turpin and her husband Claude have now gone home from the doctor's office. She finds herself watching the sunset behind their house that evening. And when she's looking out over the fields, she sees a vision. It's a vision of souls going up toward heaven. She's a religious person, so this shouldn't be that surprising. The problem is that in the vision she is given, the order is all wrong. There at the front of the line, she sees the freaks and the lunatics, the drunkards and the poor, the ones she has always known were beneath her. And bringing up the end of the procession, O'Connor writes, was a tribe of people whom she recognized at once as those who, like herself and Claude, had always had a little of everything and the God-given wit to use it right. She leaned forward to observe them closer. They were marching behind the others with great dignity, accountable as they always had been for good order and common sense and respectable behavior. They alone were on key. Yet she could see by their shocked and altered faces that even their virtues were being burned away. The story's called Revelation. It's a story about seeing, about what Mrs. Turpin has always seen when she looked at the world, and about what happens when she is given a glimpse of the upside-down way things really are. And the parable is really about seeing too, isn't it? In life, Lazarus was there at the gate all the time, and the rich man looked right past him. Presumably, he went in and out through this gate on a regular basis. That's kind of what gates are for. And he chose not to see this fellow human being there at his door, chose not to respond. The rich man does see Lazarus once they're both dead, of course, and there's a chasm now between them. But really, the chasm there at the end of the story isn't anything new. It's been built through a lifetime of neglect and ignorance. This great space between them and a human life that's been ignored. I think Jesus' story is finally about seeing and responding to those around us, no matter who they are. And if you ask me, we are not really either of these two main characters. We're much more like the brothers of that rich man, like the ones he wanted to warn. ones who still have time to open our eyes, who have the prophets and the scriptures and this vivid reminder of God's concern for those in poverty, who have the community to remind us, and organizations doing good and important work to uphold the rights of the poor and oppressed, who have Jesus himself, the one whose life was the supreme bridging of the chasm, who emptied himself to share the life of human beings, living in poverty and homelessness among people in need. We've got all that. And the invitation is simple: to allow Jesus to wake us up again, to let Jesus help us see past ourselves to those in need in our home contexts, right here in Geneva, and not simply to see them, but to see them as God's own children, as our own brothers and sisters with a claim on us, to see them as God's beloved and to see ourselves bound together in this world. Not because if we don't, we're headed for the flames, but because if we don't see past ourselves and do something, we miss what life is really about. We miss what Timothy calls the life that really is life. Because if we don't see and we don't act, we find ourselves building chasms instead of bridging them. And friends, God is never into chasms separating people from one another and people from God. God is never into chasms. Just ask Jesus. Amen.